Unfortunately, starting this month, the Brazilian economy will be penalized by more than 15 billion reais per year because of unfair trade tariffs on our exports. But wait a minute, do you think that I am talking about the American tariff hike? Big mistake. I am talking about the Chinese tariff hike against our agribusiness, an absurdity that the Brazilian left tries to sweep under the rug, along with your selective defense of national sovereignty. Well, in case you don't know, Brazil is the largest exporter of beef on the planet. There are more than 3.5 million tons per year. That brought just in 2025 more than $18 billion to Brazil, a fundamental revenue for the positive balance of our trade balance, which strengthens our currency and helps to control inflation. And half of all this Brazilian meat goes to China, a market that in the last decades has increased 10 times its demand for animal protein. It happens that at the end of last year, the Chinese Communist Party imposed quotas on meat imports, limiting the purchase of Brazilian meat to 1.1 million tons. It seems like a lot, but just in 2025, we exported about 1.7 million tons of meat to China. In other words, overnight, our biggest buyers decided with a stroke of a pen to reduce by 1/3 our participation in the largest consumer market in the world. Whoever insists on buying Brazilian meat beyond the quota stipulated by the government, 67% of trade tariffs, 12% being the standard tariff, and 55% being the surcharge applicable beyond the quota. It is obvious that this virtually makes competition unfeasible and will take Brazilian meat off the plate of Chinese in this second semester. Let's agree that 67% tariff against our agribusiness, coming from our main trading partner, is a much bigger scandal than the 25% of Trump's massive tariff, especially because the Americans published a list with more than 2,000 items that are exempt from this surcharge, including meats, fish, coffees, citrus, fruits. This, in practice, led to an average effective tax rate of 14%. And what I mean by that? The Trump tariff hike makes it difficult, but it does not make exporting to the United States unfeasible. But the Chinese tariff hike makes it impossible for Brazilian meat to be competitive in its largest market. Of whom are we more dependent? In other words, China imposed a loss on Brazil much greater than the United States, but for some reason, Lula only criticizes Trump and Marco Rubio, but spares Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. Why could that be? Look, essentially, it is for ideological reasons. Narrative. Lula never hid that he is an admirer of the Chinese leader Mao Zedong, the genocidaire responsible for the massacre of political opponents and for the death of tens of millions of his own compatriots by hunger. According to the workers, the Chinese dictator fought for that, which he thought was right, fought to transform something. Lula is also an enthusiast of China's authoritarian regime, the repression of dissent, and its censorship of the civilian population, so much so that he recently requested the Chinese president help to regulate Brazilian social networks and limit freedom of expression on the internet. But I made a point of talking to President Xi Jinping about the need for us to have a person to discuss this issue, of what to do in the regulation and in the treatment of these app companies. And Mauro Vieira received a letter from Xi Jinping that he promised to send the person to talk. When the person comes to talk, it is Sidonio who will receive this person to talk. And we want to speed up the regulation. Lula, who already said to feel proud when called a communist, does not publicly criticize the imperialist and military pretensions of China in Tibet or in the South Sea. The Workers' Party member also never said a peep about the increase in Chinese influence, economic dependency agreements, and infrastructure, a strategy from Beijing to co-opt support of governments of poor countries or in development, especially in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, and here in Latin America. On the other hand, according to Lula, it is Donald Trump who behaves like the emperor of the world. The difference is that, unlike Xi Jinping, Trump governs because he was elected by a free people. He answers to a Congress in which there is political opposition, and he is overseen by an independent judiciary. And in the case of the commercial tariffs imposed on Brazil by the United States and by China, Lula exhibits this same double standard and this same selective indignation. Lula offends Trump publicly, speaks of an attack on sovereignty in the case of the American 20% tariff and 5%, but he does not open his beak to criticize the Chinese and its massive tariff of 67% on Brazilian agribusiness. It is one more clear evidence that the Workers' Party member places his ideology above the national interest and confirms what the American Secretary of State already said. Lula places his ego ahead of the well-being of Brazilians.